Alrighty guys, so the first thing I want to do today is kind of recap over drawing out these supply and demand curves, because we're going to start combining them together and we're going to look at what happens to prices based on changes of supply and demand. So first things first is mapping out both of these curves together. So what I would recommend doing is just ignoring half of it to start out with. So we're just looking at mapping out the supply curve, right? And so we're looking at a pair of shoes, and as the price of the shoes goes up, a business is going to be willing to supply more and more of those shoes because they're going to make a higher profit at the higher amount that they sell it. So again, we're not thinking about demand in this case, we're just looking at supply. So let me go ahead and start mapping it out here. Let me make sure you can see it on here first. I can make it a little bit bigger. Alright, so let's look at our supply and demand curve here. So first off, we set it up just like we would any other demand curve or any other supply curve, with price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. Alright, so we'll start off with price, right? The lowest price for these shoes, we have $30, and it goes up from there. $30, $50, $70, $90, and $110 for this pair of shoes. So let's start off with our supply curve here. All right, and so we've got 100 pairs of shoes, 200 pairs, 300, 400, and 500. All right, so first off, at $30, the business is only going to supply 100 pair of these shoes because they're not making a lot of money off of it. But as the price increases to $50, now they'd be willing to supply 200 pairs. At 70, they'd be willing to supply even more. All right, and at 110 is where they'd be willing to supply the most, because that's where they're going to have the highest profit. So we'll label this S for our supply curve. All right, now we can do the other side of things. Pretend that this side doesn't exist right here. So we're just going to map out demand. So at $30 is where our demand is going to be highest. At $30, 500 people are going to be willing to buy this pair of shoes. All right, at $50, fewer people are going to want to buy them because they're more expensive. All right, at $70, the demand would be 300. And at $90, it'd be 200, and at 110, that's where the fewest people would want them. So we've got our demand curve, which always goes in a downwards direction. We've got our supply curve, that always goes in an upwards direction. And we've got this point in the middle where they meet called the equilibrium price. And this is generally where prices fluctuate. This is generally where prices go to. So if the business had it their way, they would set their prices at $110. But not many people would buy the shoes then. They would have a lot of shoes left over. If we had it our way, we'd set the price at $30. But since the business wouldn't be making very much money, they wouldn't be producing enough of those shoes. All right, so generally we meet somewhere in the middle at what we call this equilibrium price. Equilibrium just means balance. And so the equilibrium price here would be $70. That's where our supply and demand meet at 300 pairs. So if I were the owner of that shoe store, I would set my prices at $70 because that's the highest I can raise my prices without having anything left over. If I raise my prices to $90, I'd be willing to supply 400, but only 200 pairs would be bought. So I'd have 200 pairs left over. I'd have a surplus of 200 pairs. All right, so an equilibrium price is the highest point a business should raise their prices, otherwise they'll start losing out on profit. Oops. Let me get back to the right slide. All right, a couple other things I want to look at with supply before we start working on these shifters again. All right, so first off, I want to look at the difference between the terms revenue and profit. People get these mixed up all the time. Revenue is just the amount of money that a business makes. So if I bought 10 cheeseburgers at $7 a piece, then the restaurant's revenue would be $70. Now their profit would be that revenue minus the cost. So if they made $70 from me, but it cost them $50 to make the burger, well then their profit is only $20. So revenue is the money that they make, that's the $70 they got from me, minus the cost, how much it costs them to make that product. All right, and so the idea behind a business is they want to produce as much as they can before that cost outweighs the revenue. And so to go back to the restaurant example, right, if I'm a manager looking at hiring on employees, If I'm looking at going from 2 workers to 3 workers, well, as long as that 3rd worker makes me more money than they're costing me, it's beneficial. But once I get to that 8th or 9th worker, chances are they're not going to help me as much. They're not going to make me as much money as the first couple workers would. So marginal revenue is looking at how much more money you gain by adding one of something. Marginal cost is looking at what you're taking away by adding or subtracting one of something. All right, so here we have our equilibrium price again. All right, so equilibrium price is where supply and demand meet one another. And so from the example before, the shoes, the equilibrium price was $70. But the key thing here, and the equilibrium quantity is 300 pairs. If I were the shoe store, I would produce 300 pairs of shoes, and I would sell them at $70 a piece. So another name for this equilibrium price is also called the market clearing price. Because theoretically, if you set everything at the exact right price, at the end of the day, everything should be sold out at your store. All right, even though that's not necessarily how it works out in reality. All right, but this equilibrium price can change. All right, so let's say that we're looking at this pair of shoes. All right, and let's say that like we did with the activity yesterday, let's say that the leather in the shoes gets more expensive. Well, then think about it. If the leather gets more expensive, are we going to be able to provide more or less of those shoes? Well, if it's more expensive, our supply is going to decrease, in which case this curve will shift to the left. All right, so now I want to look at what's happened to that equilibrium price. Before it was at $70, and now it's a little bit closer to $90. And that makes sense, right? If the leather gets more expensive in the shoes, then the shoes are probably going to get more expensive as well, right? And so we can look at it with demand also. Let's say that we're looking at what happened with Nike back in the early 2000s. All right, when everybody started finding out that their tennis shoes were made in sweatshops. Well, if their tennis shoes are made in sweatshops, think about if that's going to affect the supply of shoes or the demand for the shoes. Does it affect our ability to make the shoes or how much people want the shoes? So if people are upset and are boycotting Nike, then it's going to be the demand for these shoes. And so if fewer people are willing to buy these shoes at the same price, then our curve is going to slide to the left. Now people probably aren't going to spend $110 on it. Fewer people are going to buy it at 90 or 70 or 50 or every price really. All right, and so then our demand curve would shift to the left. All right, and so then now look at what's happened with our equilibrium price. Before it was $70, now it's closer to $50. And so since our demand for these shoes is decreasing, they're going to need to become cheaper. But also, I mean, you know, the opposite happens as well. Like if you look at Air Jordans or something like that, right? After that big advertising campaign by Spike Lee and Air Jordan in the 90s, demand for Air Jordans skyrocketed. All right, and so because of that, their equilibrium price jumped, and they're able to sell way more, or shoes at a way higher price than anybody else. So this is how we can use these supply and demand curves. We can use it to look at different scenarios and to determine at what prices things will be set at. Sorry guys, bear with me for one moment. I just realized I might not have deleted something, in which case this video might get cut short. No, I think we're good. All right, one of the last things I want to look at is what we call price ceilings and price floors. So a price ceiling is a maximum that we can charge for a good. All right, you can't go above the ceiling. All right, and so let's look at when the government would use this. All right, so the government would use this in cases where they're trying to help out the consumers, the people. So let's say that normally the equilibrium price of this pair of shoes is $70. But the government decides, all right, we want to make sure that everyone can afford a pair of shoes. So we're going to tell businesses they can't charge more than $30 for a pair of shoes. Well, if that were the case, businesses wouldn't be willing to supply that many pairs, right? Their supply would be low. It would only be 100. At the same time, if everyone can afford shoes, if everyone is looking at buying shoes for $30, the demand is going to be really high. And so if our demand is 500 pairs and our supply is only 100, then that means we're going to have a shortage of about 400 pairs. People are going to want to buy more shoes than the company's willing to provide. All right, and so you see this with apartments in New York City. All right, so several years ago, Actually, let's pause it right here. I want to make sure that we've got enough space for both videos. All right, go ahead. In a second, you're just going to flip down to the second video real quick. 1 minute.